My name is Rebecca. I'm 22 years old, and the day I walked across that graduation stage should have been the proudest moment of my life. Instead, I sat alone in my cap and gown, clutching an envelope that my father had shoved into my hands that morning. Inside were disownment papers. Head looked me dead in the eye and said I was dead to the family because I refused to drop out and marry his business partner, a man 3 decades older than me. My heart was shattered into 1,000 pieces, but I was determined to walk across that stage with my head held high. As the ceremony began, I could feel their eyes on me from the audience, my father's contempt burning into my back, my mother's cold indifference, my brother's cruel smirk. They came here to watch me suffer. They came here to gloat. But what they didn't know was that when the CEO called my name in a few minutes, everything was about to change. Everything. Before we dive into what happened next, tell me where you're watching from right now. Are you someone who's ever felt betrayed by the people who were supposed to love you most? If this story resonates with you, hit that like button and subscribe, because you need to hear how this ends. Trust me, the next few minutes will leave you speechless. Now let me take you back to where this nightmare really began. 3 months before graduation, I was flying high. I'd worked my entire life to get to this point, maintaining a perfect grade point average at one of the most prestigious business schools in the country. Every professor knew my name, not because of my family's money, but because I earned my place at the top of every class. My father, Richard Caldwell, owned a successful construction company that had been in our family for 2 generations. My mother, Diane, had always been the picture-perfect corporate wife, cold and calculating, more concerned with appearances than actual emotions. And then there was my younger brother, Trevor, the golden child who could do no wrong despite failing out of 2 colleges and spending his trust fund on sports cars and bottle service at clubs. I thought I was the success story they'd been waiting for. I thought they'd finally be proud of me. I was so wrong. It happened at one of our formal family dinners, the kind where the chandelier cost more than most people's cars, and the silence between courses felt like a weapon. My father cleared his throat and announced, as casually as if he were discussing the weather, that I would be marrying Gerald Hartwell. I actually laughed at first because I thought it was some kind of joke. Gerald Hartwell was 53 years old, had been married twice before, and was one of my father's investors. When I realized my father was serious, the laughter died in my throat. He explained it like a business transaction, which I suppose to him it was. Gerald would invest $10 million into the company in exchange for my hand in marriage. $10 million that my father desperately needed because, as I would later discover, his company was hemorrhaging money due to his terrible decisions and risky investments. I refused. I looked my father straight in the eye and said, absolutely not. I told him I had job offers from 3 major corporations, that I'd worked too hard to throw my life away on some arranged marriage to a man older than he was. The explosion that followed was volcanic. My father's face turned purple with rage, veins bulging in his neck as he screamed that I was an ungrateful, selfish brat who didn't understand sacrifice or family loyalty. My mother, ever the dutiful wife, immediately took his side, her voice dripping with disdain as she accused me of destroying the family with my selfishness. She actually said that, as if my refusing to be sold like property was somehow the problem. And Trevor, oh, Trevor just sat there with that smug smile, saying that this was what happened when you let women get educated, that I should just obey like a good daughter and stop causing problems. He said I was just a woman and should know my place. The dinner ended with my father standing up so violently his chair fell backward, pointing at me with a shaking finger, and telling me that I would regret this defiance. At the time, I thought it was just empty threats from a man who wasn't used to being told no. I thought if I just stood my ground, eventually they'd accept my decision and we could move forward. I had no idea that this was just the beginning. I had no idea how far they were willing to go to break me. As I left that dining room, my mother's cold eyes following me, my brother's mocking laughter echoing in my ears, I felt the first crack in the foundation of everything I thought I knew about my family. But I told myself I was strong enough to handle whatever came next. Looking back now, I had no concept of just how much they were capable of hating me for daring to choose my own path. The attacks began immediately and came from every direction. Within 48 hours of that dinner, my father had cut off all my credit cards without warning. I discovered this at a grocery store when my card was declined in front of a line of people, the humiliation burning my cheeks as I had to leave my cart and walk out empty-handed. My car, which had been a gift for my 18th birthday, was repossessed from the university parking lot. I came out of class to find an empty space where it should have been, and when I called my father, he told me that disobedient daughters didn't deserve privileges. My mother stopped speaking to me entirely, blocking my number and instructing the household staff that I was no longer welcome at the family home. When I tried to visit to pick up some of my belongings, the security guards, men who had known me since I was a child, had to physically turn me away with apologetic looks in their eyes. But Trevor, my baby brother who I'd protected from bullies in elementary school and helped with his homework through high school, he took a special kind of pleasure in destroying me. He started spreading vicious rumors at my university, telling anyone who would listen that I was sleeping with professors to get my grades, that I was a cheater and a fraud who didn't deserve my academic success. I started noticing the looks from other students, the whispers that stopped when I walked into a room. The way people I'd studied with for years suddenly found reasons to avoid me. My reputation, something I'd spent 4 years building through hard work and integrity, was being systematically demolished by my own brother's lies, and he was just getting started. Then came the anonymous emails. Someone was sending detailed messages to the scholarship committee, accusing me of academic dishonesty and providing fabricated evidence of plagiarism. My scholarships, which covered nearly half my tuition, were suddenly under review. I had to appear before a committee and defend myself against accusations that were completely false, watching their skeptical faces as I tried to prove my innocence without any idea who was attacking me. It was Trevor. I discovered this by accident when I saw his laptop open in a coffee shop near campus, an email draft visible with the scholarship committee's address, and another round of false accusations ready to send. When I confronted him, he didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. He laughed, that same cruel laugh from the dinner table, and told me that father had ordered him to do whatever it took to force me to drop out. If I wasn't in school, I couldn't graduate. If I couldn't graduate, I'd have no choice but to come crawling back and accept the marriage to Gerald. My father's third attack was the most devastating yet. He called my internship at a prestigious marketing firm, a position I'd competed against hundreds of applicants to secure, and told them I'd been caught stealing from the family business. It was a complete lie, but it was his word, a respected businessman, against mine, a student with no proof of my innocence. They let me go the same day, the HR manager looking uncomfortable as she told me that they couldn't have someone with questionable ethics representing their company. I tried to explain, tried to tell them it was a family dispute and nothing was true, but the decision was final. My professional reputation, the internship that would have led to a full-time job offer after graduation, was gone in a single phone call. With no financial support, no car, and no internship income, I had to scramble to survive my final semester. I picked up 3 part-time jobs, working the night shift at a diner where drunk college students left terrible tips, the day shift at the university library for minimum wage, and weekends at a retail store in the mall. I was getting maybe 4 hours of sleep a night, living on coffee and whatever food I could afford, which wasn't much. I moved out of my decent apartment near campus into a tiny basement studio in a rough neighborhood, the kind of place where you heard sirens every night and checked your locks 3 times before bed. The walls were thin enough that I could hear my neighbors arguing. The ceiling leaked when it rained, and I shared the space with more cockroaches than I cared to count. But it was all I could afford, and even that was barely manageable. Through all of this, I kept going to class, kept studying, kept pushing forward because giving up would mean they won. Every morning I woke up exhausted in that basement apartment, put on my best professional clothes that were starting to look worn, and went to class with my head held high. My grades didn't slip. If anything, I worked harder, driven by spite and determination to prove that they couldn't break me. But the isolation was crushing. My former best friend Jessica, who I'd known since we were 7 years old, who'd been my maid of honor at my imaginary childhood weddings and knew all my secrets, suddenly stopped returning my calls. We'd been inseparable for 15 years, and then one day she just vanished from my life. No explanation, no goodbye, just gone. I ran into her at a coffee shop weeks later and demanded to know what happened. The guilt on her face told me everything before she said a word. Through tears, she admitted that my father had approached her parents, who were struggling with their mortgage after her dad lost his job. He paid off their entire mortgage, a debt of $300,000, in exchange for Jessica cutting me out of her life completely. He wanted me isolated, wanted me to have no support system, wanted me utterly alone so I'd have no choice but to come back to him. And Jessica, my best friend, had let herself be bought. She tried to apologize, said her family needed the help, that she had no choice. But she did have a choice. She chose money over 15 years of friendship. She chose my father's bribe over loyalty. That betrayal hurt almost as much as my family's because at least with them, I was starting to understand they'd never really loved me. But Jessica, I'd trusted her with everything. I walked away from her in that coffee shop, and I never looked back. That night, alone in my basement apartment with the flickering overhead light and the sound of my neighbors screaming at each other through the walls, I let myself cry for the first time since this nightmare began. I cried for the family I thought I had. I cried for the best friend who sold me out. I cried for the girl I used to be, who believed that hard work and integrity mattered, who thought the people who loved you would stand by you. That girl was gone now. In her place was someone harder, more cynical, but also more determined than ever to survive. They wanted to break me. They wanted me desperate and broken and begging. But I was still standing, barely, and I would make it to that graduation stage if it killed me. 2 weeks before graduation, my body decided it had had enough of what my mind was putting it through. I was working the night shift at the diner, my third shift in a row with no sleep in between, running on nothing but black coffee and stubborn pride. The exhaustion had become so normal that I barely noticed it anymore. The way my hands shook when I carried plates, the way my vision would blur if I stood up too quickly, the constant headache that pounded behind my eyes. I was pouring coffee for a customer when the room started spinning. The pot slipped from my hands, ceramic shattering on the floor, hot coffee splashing everywhere. And then I was falling, the ground rushing up to meet me, and everything went black. I woke up in the emergency room with fluorescent lights burning my eyes and an IV in my arm. The doctor, a tired-looking woman in her 40s, told me I'd collapsed from severe exhaustion and malnutrition. My body had simply shut down from the stress and lack of proper care. She said I was lucky I hadn't hit my head when I fell, or the outcome could have been much worse. They wanted to keep me overnight for observation, ran tests to make sure there was no permanent damage. As I lay in that hospital bed, staring at the white ceiling tiles, I waited for someone to come. Surely the hospital would have called my emergency contacts. Surely my mother would show up, or even Trevor, just to make sure I wasn't dying. Hours passed. No one came. The silence was deafening. A hospital social worker visited me the next morning. A kind-faced man named Robert who sat down with concerned eyes and asked about my family situation. I could see he'd noticed the lack of visitors, the way I had no one to call when they needed to discuss my treatment. I lied smoothly, told him my family was traveling overseas and couldn't be reached, that I had friends who would help me once I was discharged. The lies came easily now after months of hiding my situation from professors and classmates, pretending everything was fine when my life was falling apart. Robert didn't look convinced, but he couldn't force me to tell the truth. He gave me pamphlets about resources for students in crisis, food banks and counseling services, his business card with a handwritten note to call if I needed anything. I thanked him and threw the pamphlets away as soon as he left because accepting help felt like admitting defeat. I discharged myself against medical advice the next day because I couldn't afford the hospital bill and I had a shift at the library I couldn't miss. Every muscle in my body ached as I walked back to my apartment, the spring air feeling cold despite the sunshine because I'd lost so much weight that I was always freezing now. When I reached my building, there was a bright orange notice on my door. Eviction. 30 days to vacate the premises. My rent was paid through the end of the month, so I didn't understand until I read the fine print. The building had been sold to a new owner who was renovating and terminating all existing leases. I called the landlord, and his uncomfortable silence told me everything. He finally admitted that yes, a company had bought the building, and yes, that company was owned by Richard Caldwell. My father had bought my apartment building for the sole purpose of evicting me. With 2 weeks until graduation, I was officially homeless. I had $700 in my bank account, no car, no family, no friends, and nowhere to live. I spent that night in a 24-hour diner, nursing a single cup of coffee for 8 hours while I tried to figure out what to do. Shelters were full. I'd called 3 already. Cheap hotels were still more than I could afford for 2 weeks. I considered dropping out, just giving up on graduation, because what was the point of a degree if I was living on the streets? That's what my father wanted. He wanted me desperate enough to come back to him on my knees, to accept Gerald's proposal, to let myself be sold off like property because I had no other options left. The thought made me sick. In the end, I did something I'd sworn I wouldn't do. I slept in the university library. There were study rooms on the 4th floor that most students didn't use, quiet corners with comfortable chairs where I could lock the door and catch a few hours of sleep between my shifts. I became an expert at timing the security rounds, at looking like I was just studying late whenever someone walked by, at freshening up in the bathroom before morning classes started. I kept my backpack with all my essential belongings with me at all times. Everything else, the few pieces of furniture and kitchen items I'd accumulated, I sold or left behind. My entire life fit into one backpack now. Professor Martinez noticed something was wrong after about 3 days of this. She was my advanced corporate strategy professor, a brilliant woman in her 60s with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She asked me to stay after class one day, and when everyone else had left, she closed the door and asked me directly if I was living in the library. I tried to deny it, but she cut through my lies with the precision of someone who'd seen too many struggling students try to hide their situations. She told me she'd seen me coming out of the study rooms at 6 in the morning, looking exhausted and wearing the same clothes as the day before. She'd noticed I'd lost weight, that my usually meticulous appearance was starting to slip, that I had the hollow-eyed look of someone running on empty. Professor Martinez offered me her couch. Just like that, no questions, no judgment, just a simple offer of help. I wanted to refuse because accepting felt like weakness, felt like admitting I couldn't handle this on my own. But I was so tired, bone deep, exhausted in a way that sleep couldn't fix, and the thought of a safe place to rest was too tempting to resist. I accepted, and that night I slept on her couch in her small faculty apartment for 10 hours straight, the first real sleep I'd had in weeks. When I woke up, there was food in the kitchen and a note saying to help myself to anything. I cried again, overwhelmed by this simple kindness from someone who owed me nothing. Over the next few days, as I stayed with Professor Martinez and slowly started to feel human again, she asked me more questions about my situation. I told her everything, the whole sordid story spilling out in a rush. The forced marriage, my father's attacks, Trevor's cruelty, my mother's coldness, Jessica's betrayal, all of it. I expected shock or pity, but instead, Professor Martinez got a strange look on her face. She asked me a question that seemed random at the time. She asked about my mother's maiden name. Morrison, I told her. My mother was Diane Morrison before she married my father. Professor Martinez's eyes widened, and she said something that would change everything. She said, "Do you know who your maternal grandmother was?" I remembered my grandmother Catherine vaguely, like a warm dream from early childhood that fades upon waking. She died when I was 5 years old, and my memories were fragments, scattered pieces of a puzzle I'd never thought to put together. I remembered her hands, wrinkled and soft, always holding mine. I remembered her laugh, bright and genuine in a way my mother's never was. I remembered she gave me a necklace before she died, a simple silver chain with a small pendant, and told me to keep it always. My father had taken it away shortly after her funeral, said it was too valuable for a child, and I never saw it again. When I asked about her over the years, my father would dismiss her as that crazy old woman who wasted her life on foolish dreams. and my mother would simply refuse to discuss her at all. Professor Martinez sat me down at her kitchen table with a cup of tea. I didn't drink because my hands were shaking too much to hold the cup steady. She asked if I knew what Catherine Morrison did for a living. I shook my head. All I knew was she had money, though how much I didn't know, and that my mother had inherited something, but it had been tied up in family trusts or something complicated I never understood. Professor Martinez took a deep breath and told me that Catherine Morrison was one of the pioneers of tech innovation in the 80s and 90s. That she'd founded a software company that revolutionized data management systems, that she'd been a billionaire by the time she was 40. My grandmother, the woman my father called crazy, had been one of the most brilliant minds of her generation. The room felt like it was tilting. I tried to process this information, but it didn't make sense with the fragments I'd been told my whole life. If my grandmother was so successful, why did my father act like she was an embarrassment? Professor Martinez continued, and each word was like a bomb going off in my understanding of my own history. She told me that Catherine Morrison had a complicated relationship with my mother, that Diane had always been ashamed of her mother's career focus and unconventional choices, that she'd married Richard partly to have the traditional family life Catherine never provided. When Catherine died, she left behind a massive fortune and a very specific will. Professor Martinez stood up and retrieved a folder from her desk, thick with documents, and placed it in front of me. Inside were legal papers, trust documents, letters. She explained that Catherine had created a trust fund specifically for me, her only grandchild. The trust was worth approximately $50 million. I stopped breathing. $50 million. The number was so large it didn't feel real, couldn't be real. But Professor Martinez kept talking, explaining the terms. The trust would activate only when I turned 22 years old and graduated from a 4-year university program. Both conditions had to be met. If I failed to graduate, the money would be held until I turned 25. At which point, if I still hadn't graduated, it would all go to charity. Catherine had designed it this way intentionally, Professor Martinez explained. She'd wanted to ensure that I got an education, that I had the tools and knowledge to manage wealth responsibly, that I wasn't just handed money but earned the right to access it through my own hard work. And there was more. Professor Martinez revealed that she herself had been Catherine Morrison's protégé, that Catherine had mentored her when she was a young professor, that Catherine had made Professor Martinez, the trustee of this fund, with instructions to watch over me from a distance, to step in only if I was in serious danger. That's why she'd noticed my situation, why she'd offered help. She'd been Catherine's eyes, watching and protecting, waiting for this moment. My mind was reeling, trying to understand the implications. If this trust existed, if my graduation triggered $50 million, then that meant my father knew. He had to know. Professor Martinez confirmed it with a grim nod. Of course he knew. My mother knew. Trevor knew. They'd all known since I was born that someday I would inherit Catherine's fortune. That's why my father had been so desperate to stop my graduation, why the attacks had escalated so dramatically in my final semester. If I didn't graduate, the money stayed locked away. And more than that, if he could control me, if he could force me into a marriage with Gerald, then he could potentially access the money through me. I would graduate eventually, and if I was married to Gerald, a man who was deeply in debt to my father, then Richard could manipulate us both to get to Catherine's fortune. Everything clicked into place with horrifying clarity. My father's company wasn't just struggling, it was bankrupt. The $10 million from Gerald wasn't actually an investment. It was borrowed from loan sharks and dangerous people, a desperate gamble that depended on my father gaining access to my trust fund to pay everyone back. My mother's coldness, her eagerness to sell me off, was because she wanted that money too, wanted the lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to that was rapidly disappearing as my father's business crumbled. Trevor's vicious attacks were because he knew that $50 million was going to me and not him, that the golden child was about to be overshadowed by the sister head tormented. Every single thing they'd done, every cruelty, every betrayal, every attempt to break me, was all about money. They didn't care about me at all. They never had. Professor Martinez watched my face as I processed this, her expression sad and knowing. She told me there was still more, The trust wasn't just money, it was controlling shares in Morrison Industries, the company Catherine had founded. Morrison Industries was now worth billions, traded publicly, employed thousands of people. And when I graduated, when that trust activated, I would own 51% of the company. I would effectively be the majority shareholder, the controlling interest. I would have more power than my father ever dreamed of. Catherine hadn't just left me money, Shed left me an empire. And Shed designed it so carefully, so specifically, knowing somehow that I would need protection from my own family. There were letters, too. Letters from Catherine written before she died, sealed with instructions to give them to me when I turned 22. Professor Martinez handed me the first envelope, and with shaking hands, I opened it. My grandmother's handwriting was elegant and strong, and her words made me cry for the first time, not from sadness but from feeling truly loved by someone. She wrote that she saw so much of herself in me, even as a 5-year-old, that she knew my mother would try to change me and dim my light, that she knew Richard would try to use me. She wrote that she was sorry she couldn't protect me while she was alive, but she'd done everything in her power to protect me after she was gone. She told me to be strong, to finish my education, to never let anyone make me feel small. She wrote, "You are Morrison blood, and we are survivors, we are fighters, and we never let the world tell us we can't do extraordinary things." I sat in Professor Martinez's kitchen reading and rereading that letter, memorizing every word, feeling like I was meeting my grandmother for the first time. Shed known what kind of people my mother and father were, and Shed created this elaborate protection for me, a fortress of money and power that would activate at exactly the moment I needed it most. Graduation was in 1 week. In 1 week, I would turn 22. In 1 week, everything would change. But first, I had to survive whatever my father was going to throw at me when he realized I was still going to walk across that stage. Professor Martinez warned me that he would make one last desperate attempt to stop me, that men like Richard didn't go down without a fight. She told me to be ready for anything. I thought I was prepared. I wasn't even close. Graduation morning dawned gray and overcast, clouds threatening rain, which felt appropriate for what was about to become the worst morning of my life before it became the best day. I was at Professor Martinez's apartment getting ready, putting on my cap and gown, trying to steady my shaking hands enough to apply makeup to hide the dark circles that never quite went away despite finally sleeping regularly. Professor Martinez made me breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast, fussing over me like the grandmother I'd lost. I was too nervous to eat much. My 22nd birthday was officially in 3 hours, and graduation started at 2 in the afternoon. By tonight, I would either be free or destroyed. There was no middle ground left. The knock on the door came at 9 in the morning. Professor Martinez looked through the peephole and her face went pale. She whispered to me that it was my father, and he wasn't alone. My heart dropped into my stomach. I wanted to hide, to pretend I wasn't there, but Professor Martinez shook her head. She said we might as well face this now, that running would only delay the inevitable. She opened the door, and there stood my father in an expensive suit that couldn't hide how much weight he'd lost from stress, flanked by a slick-looking lawyer carrying a briefcase. Behind them were my mother, dressed in her pearls and judgment, Trevor with his phone already out recording, and Gerald Hartwell with his predatory smile that made my skin crawl. They pushed their way into the apartment without being invited, my father's presence sucking all the air out of the room. The lawyer, who introduced himself as Mr. Pemberton in a voice like oil, immediately took control. He opened his briefcase and pulled out papers, laying them on Professor Martinez's coffee table with the precision of someone who'd done this before. Disownment papers. Official legal documents that would sever all family ties, remove me from any family assets or inheritance, make it as if I'd never been born a Caldwell. My father stood over me, his face hard and cold, and delivered his ultimatum. "Sign these papers right now," he said, "or we will contest Catherine's trust fund in court. We'll drag you through years of legal battles," he continued. "Tie up that money until you're 40. Make sure you never see a cent of it." Mr. Pemberton added that they had grounds to contest the will based on Catherine's mental state when she created the trust, that they would argue undue influence and manipulation, that I'd poisoned her mind against the family. It was all lies. But lies delivered by expensive lawyers could do a lot of damage. My father's strategy was clear. If he couldn't access the money through me, he'd make sure I couldn't access it either. If he was going down, he'd take me with him. The disownment papers came with conditions. In exchange for me agreeing to cut all family ties and giving up any claim to Caldwell family assets, which were worth nothing, but I didn't know that yet, they would agree not to legally challenge the trust. I would be free to receive Catherine's inheritance without interference, but I would be completely alone, with no family, my name stripped from me. It was a devil's bargain designed to hurt me emotionally even as I gained everything financially. My father wanted me to know that even in victory, I would be abandoned and unloved. Gerald chose that moment to step forward, his cologne overwhelming, his eyes roaming over me in a way that made me want to shower. He said I could still change my mind, that if I married him today, right now, we could call off the lawyers and be one big happy family again. He actually used those words, happy family, as if that had ever existed. He said it'd come crawling back eventually when I was desperate and alone, that it'd realize I needed them. The arrogance in his voice, the certainty that I would fail without them, made me want to scream. My mother, who hadn't spoken to me in months, finally broke her silence to deliver a verbal knife to my heart. She told me it'd always been a disappointment, that Catherine had poisoned my mind against them, that I was throwing away my family for money just like Catherine had thrown away hers for career ambition. Trevor was filming everything on his phone, laughing, narrating for his social media like this was entertainment. He said this was going viral, that everyone was going to see me get disowned, that I was going to be famous for being a selfish daughter who chose money over family. The cruelty was breathtaking. These were the people who'd raised me, who I'd loved and tried desperately to please for 22 years. And they were treating my destruction like a spectator sport. Professor Martinez tried to intervene, stepping between me and my father, telling them they needed to leave immediately or she'd call campus security. My father turned his venom on her, threatening her job, saying he'd make calls to the university board, that he'd destroy her career for interfering in family business. The room was spinning again like it had in the diner before I collapsed, but this time from emotional overload rather than physical exhaustion. Mr. Pemberton pushed the papers toward me with a pen, tapping his watch, saying I had 5 minutes to decide or the offer was off the table and the legal assault would begin. 5 minutes to choose between family and freedom, between the past and the future, between people who hated me and money I'd never asked for. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the pen. I looked at my father's face, hard and unforgiving, no trace of love or regret. I looked at my mother, who couldn't even meet my eyes. I looked at Trevor, still filming, still laughing, and I looked at Gerald, already imagining he owned me. I signed the papers. My signature was messy, shaking, tear-stained because I couldn't stop crying, even though I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. But I signed every page, initialing every clause, agreeing to be legally disowned, to give up the Caldwell name, to cease being their daughter, their sister. The moment my pen left the last page, my father smiled. It was a cruel, triumphant smile that said he'd won, that he'd broken me, that even though I was getting the money, he'd made sure I knew I was worthless and alone. He gathered up the papers, handed them to Mr. Pemberton, and delivered his final blow. He said I was dead to them, that I should never try to contact them again, that I wasn't allowed to use their name anymore. Just like that, I stopped being Rebecca Caldwell. They left the apartment in a storm of expensive perfume and cruel laughter. Trevor's phone still recording. My mother not even looking back. The door closed behind them and I collapsed onto Professor Martinez's couch, sobbing so hard I couldn't breathe. I'd done it. I'd legally severed all ties with my family. I'd chosen the inheritance over them, which was exactly what they'd accused me of doing. Even though they'd forced this choice, even though none of this was what I wanted, all I'd ever wanted was for them to love me, to be proud of me, to choose me over their greed. And instead, I was sitting on a stranger's couch in a borrowed apartment, legally orphaned, about to graduate with no one in the audience who cared. Professor Martinez held me while I cried, not saying anything because there was nothing to say that would make this better. Eventually the tears stopped because I ran out of them. my eyes swollen and burning, my throat raw. She helped me fix my makeup, helped me put myself back together physically even though emotionally I was shattered. She told me that I'd done the right thing, that they had no power over me now, that I was free. But freedom felt heavy and cold. In a few hours, I had to walk onto that graduation stage and pretend everything was fine. Pretend I wasn't dying inside. Pretend that being disowned by my entire family on the day I was supposed to celebrate my biggest achievement was somehow survivable. I didn't know how I was going to do it. I didn't know if I was strong enough. But Professor Martinez looked me in the eyes and told me that Catherine knew I was strong enough. That's why Shed designed everything this way. I had to believe her because I had nothing else left to believe in. The university's grand auditorium was packed with thousands of graduating students and their families when I arrived that afternoon. The building itself was beautiful, all soaring ceilings and historic architecture, with rows upon rows of seats filled with proud parents holding cameras and balloons and flowers. I walked in alone, clutching my program so tightly the paper crumpled in my fist, the Disownment papers still burning in my memory like a brand. My eyes were still puffy despite the cold compress and extra makeup, and I felt hollowed out, like someone had scooped out my insides and left just a shell walking around in a cap and gown. All around me, other graduates were hugging their families, taking photos, laughing with excitement. I had no one. I found my assigned seat in the sea of graduates, organized alphabetically, and sat down carefully, like I might shatter if I moved too quickly. That's when I saw them. My family was here. Of course they were here. They hadn't come to support me, they'd come to gloat, to watch me sit alone while everyone else celebrated with loved ones, to see my public humiliation. My father was there in the family section, his face smug and satisfied, already pointing me out to the people around him. My mother sat beside him, her expression blank and cold as always, her designer sunglasses hiding her eyes. Trevor was scrolling on his phone, probably already posting about disowning his sister, and Gerald sat with them like he was already part of the family, his presence a reminder of what they'd wanted to sell me into. They'd brought friends too, other wealthy families from their social circle, who knew our business and had probably heard some version of events that made me the villain. I watched them whispering and looking at me, watched them laugh at something my father said while gesturing in my direction. The humiliation was exquisite and carefully orchestrated. They wanted me to feel small and alone in a room full of thousands of people. They wanted me to know that even in this moment of achievement, they could still hurt me. And it was working. I felt myself shrinking in my seat, wanting to disappear, wanting to run out of the auditorium and never look back. That's when I noticed other people watching too. Some of my classmates had clearly picked up on the cruel display happening in the family section. I saw confused looks, uncomfortable expressions, people leaning toward each other to whisper with frowns on their faces. One girl I'd studied with, Elena, caught my eye and gave me a sympathetic look that made me want to cry again. Even strangers could see something was wrong with how my family was acting. The shame of it all was suffocating. I spotted Jessica sitting with my family. My former best friend Huda sold our friendship for a mortgage payment, and she had the decency to look uncomfortable at least, her eyes darting away when I looked at her. The ceremony began with all the usual pomp and circumstance. The processional music playing as faculty members walked in wearing their academic regalia. The president of the university taking the podium to give an opening speech about achievement and future potential that I barely heard over the buzzing in my ears. Speaker after speaker congratulated us, told us we were the future, told us to make our families proud. I sat there feeling nothing, completely numb, just waiting for my name to be called so I could walk across that stage, accept my diploma, and leave this place forever. I'd done it. I'd survived 4 years and gotten my degree despite everything they'd thrown at me. But the victory felt hollow when I had no one to share it with. Then the dean of the business school, Dr. Patterson, took the podium and announced something I wasn't expecting. He said that before they began calling individual names, there was a special award to present. The Catherine Morrison Memorial Award, given annually to the top business student who embodied the values that Catherine Morrison had championed throughout her legendary career: innovation, integrity, independence, and resilience in the face of adversity. My heart started pounding because I'd actually forgotten I'd applied for this award. It had been months ago, just a standard application that all business students could submit, and I'd filled it out during a rare moment of hope before everything fell apart. I never thought I'd actually win. Dean Patterson began describing this year's winner without naming them yet, building suspense. He talked about a student who had overcome extraordinary obstacles, who had maintained a perfect grade point average while working multiple jobs to support themselves, who had shown exceptional character in the face of personal hardships. My hands started shaking. He continued, saying this student had demonstrated resilience when faced with family opposition, had refused to compromise their values despite extreme pressure, had embodied everything Catherine Morrison believed about the strength of educated, independent women. People in the audience were starting to look around, trying to figure out who he was talking about. The dean went on, his voice growing more passionate. He said this student had faced homelessness, harassment, and systematic sabotage of their academic career, yet had never once asked for special treatment or extensions or accommodations. This student had simply worked harder, pushed through, and maintained their integrity throughout. I could barely breathe. In the family section, I saw my father start paying attention, his smug expression faltering slightly as confusion crossed his face. My mother had straightened in her seat. Trevor had actually looked up from his phone. They were starting to realize something was happening, but they didn't know what yet. Dean Patterson said that this student had been forced to choose between family loyalty and personal autonomy, between financial security and freedom, and had made the brave choice to stand up for themselves despite the cost. He said this student had faced the worst kind of betrayal, from the people who were supposed to love and support them most, and had survived it with grace and determination. The entire auditorium was silent now, thousands of people hanging on every word. And then Dean Patterson smiled, looked directly at me, and said the words that changed everything. He said the Catherine Morrison Memorial Award goes to Catherine Morrison's own granddaughter, Rebecca Morrison Caldwell. The auditorium exploded in applause. People were standing, clapping, cheering. I sat frozen in my seat, unable to process what had just happened, unable to make my legs work to stand up. The spotlight found me, and suddenly thousands of eyes were on me, but all I could focus on was my family's section. My father's face had gone from confusion to shock to absolute rage in the space of seconds. His face turned purple, veins bulging in his neck, his hands gripping the armrests of his seat so hard his knuckles were white. My mother looked like she'd seen a ghost, all the color draining from her face. Trevor's phone had literally fallen from his hands, clattering to the floor. Gerald's mouth was hanging open in shock. They hadn't known. They hadn't known about the award. Hadn't known I was about to be publicly honored and recognized as Catherine Morrison's granddaughter in front of thousands of people. Somehow I got my legs to work and stood up, my body moving on autopilot as I made my way down the aisle toward the stage. The applause continued, growing louder, and I could hear people whispering as I passed, whispering about Catherine Morrison, about the family drama, about what the dean had said. I climbed the steps to the stage on shaking legs, and Dean Patterson shook my hand with a warm smile, handing me a certificate and a crystal award that caught the stage lights. I stood there at the podium, holding this award, looking out at thousands of faces, and I still couldn't quite believe this was happening. This was supposed to be my moment of humiliation, sitting alone while my family gloated. Instead, I was being honored, being recognized, being celebrated. Then Dean Patterson said there was one more announcement, and someone else was joining us on stage. The side door opened, and a distinguished-looking man in his 60s walked out, wearing an impeccably tailored suit, his silver hair perfectly styled, carrying himself with the confidence of someone who commanded boardrooms and controlled billions. Dean Patterson introduced him as James Wellington, the CEO of Morrison Industries, my grandmother's company, the company I was about to inherit controlling shares of. Wellington walked straight to me with a kind smile and shook my hand, and the applause somehow got even louder. He asked to say a few words, and Dean Patterson gladly handed over the microphone. James Wellington stood at that podium with the easy confidence of someone who did given thousands of speeches, and his voice carried perfectly through the auditorium's sound system. He congratulated me first, telling me that my grandmother would be incredibly proud of everything it accomplished. Then he turned to address the entire audience, and his tone shifted, becoming more serious, more purposeful. He said that Catherine Morrison had been a visionary, a woman who understood that real strength came from education and independence, who had built an empire by refusing to let anyone tell her she couldn't. He said Catherine had established this award specifically to honor students who embodied those same qualities, students who refused to be controlled or diminished by others. Wellington continued, his words carefully chosen and devastatingly precise. He said that sometimes the greatest obstacles don't come from the world at large, but from the people closest to us, the people who should be supporting us but instead try to tear us down out of jealousy or greed. The atmosphere in the auditorium shifted, people sensing that this was about more than just a generic award speech. He said that Rebecca, meaning me, had demonstrated extraordinary resilience in the face of systematic abuse, and he emphasized that word, abuse, letting it hang in the air. He said she had faced financial sabotage, social destruction, professional interference, and emotional manipulation, all designed to break her spirit and force her into compliance. I stood there beside him, my heart pounding so hard I thought everyone could hear it, watching my family's faces in the audience as they realized what was happening. This wasn't just an award ceremony. This was an exposure, a public accounting of what they'd done to me. Wellington gestured to the large screens on either side of the stage, the screens that had been showing the university logo and ceremony information. Suddenly the screens changed, and security footage appeared. It was from that morning, from outside Professor Martinez's apartment, showing my father and his lawyer and my entire family confronting me, showing me signing those disownment papers with tears streaming down my face, showing my father's triumphant smile as he collected them. The audience gasped, a collective sound of shock rippling through thousands of people. My father stood up abruptly, trying to leave, but Wellington's voice cut through the auditorium like a blade. He said, "Mr. Caldwell, please sit down, we're not finished yet." The authority in his voice was absolute. My father hesitated, looking around at thousands of faces now staring at him with expressions ranging from confusion to disgust, and slowly sat back down. Wellington continued, explaining that Morrison Industries had been monitoring my situation since my 18th birthday, per Catherine's specific instructions. She'd known, he said, that my father would try to control or exploit me, and she'd put protections in place. The screens changed again, now showing email screenshots. Trevor's messages to the scholarship committee, accusing me of academic dishonesty, time-stamped and with his name clearly visible. More emails from my father to my internship company, the lies Head told about me stealing, his demand that they fire me or lose his business. Text messages between my mother and Jessica's mother, negotiating the price of my best friend's betrayal, agreeing on the mortgage payoff in exchange for Jessica cutting me out of her life. Every cruel thing they'd done, every attack, every betrayal, all displayed on giant screens for thousands of people to see. The evidence was overwhelming and damning. Wellington's voice was ice now as he detailed each incident. He said my father's attempted bribery of professors, contacting them to offer money in exchange for failing me, was illegal and would be reported to the appropriate authorities. He said Trevor's defamation campaign, his systematic spreading of false rumors designed to destroy my academic reputation, was documented and actionable. He said my father's fraudulent claims to my employer constituted interference with business relationships and possibly criminal fraud. Every word was a hammer blow, methodically destroying any credibility my family had left. People in the audience were pulling out their phones, recording this, and I knew this was going to be everywhere by tonight. Trevor had wanted to make me viral. Instead, they were about to become infamous. Then Wellington dropped the real bombshell. He said that during Morrison Industries' investigation into my situation, they'd also investigated my father's business dealings to understand his motives. What they'd found was extensive fraud. Richard Caldwell had been falsifying financial documents, inflating property values, using company funds for personal expenses, and most seriously, borrowing money from illegal sources with no means to repay. The $10 million investment from Gerald Hartwell wasn't actually an investment at all. It was money Gerald had borrowed from loan sharks, money that was supposed to be repaid once my father gained access to my trust fund through forcing me into marriage. The entire scheme was predicated on controlling me and my inheritance. Gerald stood up at this, his face red, looking panicked. He tried to push past people to get to the aisle, but Wellington just kept talking. He said that both Mr. Caldwell's construction company and Mr. Hartwell's various business ventures were under federal investigation for fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. The FBI had been notified, charges were pending. As if on cue, uniformed police officers entered the auditorium from multiple doors. The timing was theatrical but effective. My father saw them coming and actually tried to run, pushing past people in his row, causing chaos. But there were officers at every exit. They caught him quickly, and the entire auditorium watched as Richard Caldwell was put in handcuffs in front of thousands of people. My mother was screaming, a sound of pure panic that I'd never heard from her before, her careful composure completely shattered. She was shouting that this was a mistake, that her husband was a respected businessman, that they couldn't do this here, not now, not in front of everyone. But the officers were reading my father his rights, and Wellington was still speaking, his voice cutting through my mother's hysteria. He said that Mrs. Diane Caldwell was not currently facing criminal charges but was being investigated as a potential accomplice, given the evidence that she'd been aware of and actively participated in the scheme to control me. Trevor was frantically trying to delete his social media posts, his phone in his hands, his fingers flying across the screen, but Wellington smiled coldly and said it was too late. Everything had been archived by Morrison Industries' legal team. Then Wellington turned back to me, and his expression softened. He said that despite everything I'd endured, I'd maintained my integrity and completed my education with honors. He said that Catherine's trust fund would activate today as planned, on my 22nd birthday, and that the trust was worth approximately $50 million. The number echoed through the auditorium, and I heard gasps and whispers. He said the trust also included controlling shares in Morrison Industries, making me the majority shareholder of a company currently valued at just over $8 billion. More gasps, louder now. He said that as of today, I was effectively his boss, and he was honored to work for Catherine's granddaughter. Wellington announced that Morrison Industries was offering me a position as junior executive with a starting salary of $250,000 annually, with the expectation that I would join the board of directors immediately and begin executive training. He said that if I preferred to continue my education first, the company would provide a full scholarship to any graduate program I chose, including Harvard's MBA program if I wanted it. Everything I'd ever worked for, every goal I'd set, was being handed to me, wrapped in the security of my grandmother's legacy and the backing of a billion-dollar corporation. I stood there crying again. But these were different tears. Tears of relief and vindication and overwhelming gratitude to a grandmother I barely remembered, but who had loved me enough to protect me from beyond the grave. The auditorium erupted in a standing ovation, thousands of people on their feet clapping and cheering. Through my tears, I looked out at my family's section. My father was being led out in handcuffs, still struggling, still shouting threats that no one could hear over the applause. My mother had collapsed in her seat, her face in her hands, her perfect appearance destroyed. Trevor was surrounded by his friends, and I could see them backing away from him, literally distancing themselves now that his cruelty had been exposed so publicly. Gerald had vanished entirely, probably already calling lawyers or fleeing to avoid his own arrest. Jessica was crying too, but hers were tears of shame, watching the friendship she'd sold for money crumble into nothing as everyone around her learned what she'd done. Professor Martinez had made her way to the stage and was hugging me, whispering that I'd done it, that I'd survived, that Catherine would be so proud. Dean Patterson was shaking Wellington's hand, clearly in on this plan all along. The other graduates were cheering, and I realized that my story had resonated with them, that watching someone stand up to abuse and win had given them hope for their own battles. This moment, this public reversal, wasn't just about me. It was about everyone who'd ever been controlled or diminished by people who were supposed to love them. It was about proving that you could survive, that you could escape, that you could win. And standing there on that stage, wearing my cap and gown, with my grandmother's company behind me and my future stretched out bright and limitless, I finally felt something I hadn't felt in months. I felt free. Wellington wasn't done yet. As the applause began to die down and people slowly retook their seats, he remained at the podium, his expression grave. He said there was more the audience needed to understand about the lengths some people would go to control others, and about Morrison Industries' commitment to protecting its people. He explained that Catherine Morrison had been insistent in her will that if I was ever in danger from my own family, the truth needed to be made public, not hidden away in sealed court documents or private settlements. Shed wanted accountability, wanted the world to see what happened when greed overtook love, when family became a weapon instead of a shelter. Wellington detailed how Morrison Industries had been monitoring my situation, not just passively but actively gathering evidence since I turned 18. Catherine had suspected, correctly, that my father would make his move when I reached college age, when I started becoming my own person beyond his control. Private investigators had been documenting everything, compiling a case that would hold up in any court. The surveillance footage from that morning wasn't the only evidence. There were recordings of phone calls where my father discussed his plans to sabotage me. There were financial records showing his embezzlement from his own company. There were contracts and agreements with Gerald that explicitly mentioned controlling me to access my trust fund. Every shred of proof had been meticulously gathered and verified. Wellington explained that my father's attempted bribery of professors had crossed the line from unethical to illegal. Offering money to educators to fail a student was academic fraud, and the university was pursuing charges in cooperation with local prosecutors. Professor Martinez had worn a recording device during my father's visit, capturing his explicit threats against her job and his admission that he was trying to prevent my graduation specifically to block the trust fund. That recording alone was enough for multiple charges. Trevor's defamation campaign, his systematic spreading of lies designed to destroy my academic and professional reputation, opened him up to civil lawsuits for damages. The scholarship committee was particularly interested in prosecuting since had wasted their time and resources investigating false accusations. The screens displayed more evidence now, financial documents showing the flow of money between my father's business accounts and Gerald's various shell companies. Wellington explained that Gerald Hartwell had borrowed $10 million from organized crime figures, specifically a group operating out of the tri-state area with known connections to violent enforcement. The plan had been for my father to marry me off to Gerald, and once I graduated and the trust activated, Gerald would have legal claim to half my assets as my husband. They would have drained the trust fund to pay off the loan sharks and split the remaining money. It was fraud on multiple levels, conspiracy to commit theft, and potentially even human trafficking since they were essentially trying to sell me into a marriage for financial gain. As Wellington spoke, more police officers had gathered near the family section. One approached Gerald's, now empty seat, asking people where had gone. Someone pointed toward the back exit, and officers rushed in that direction. Wellington noted dryly that Mr. Hartwell's attempt to flee the country would likely be unsuccessful since his name had been added to no-fly lists that morning. Within hours, Gerald was apprehended at the airport trying to board a private plane to the Cayman Islands with 3 suitcases full of cash. That detail would make the news that night, complete with photos of him being arrested on the tarmac, adding to the spectacle of his downfall. Wellington turned his attention to my mother, who was still sitting in her seat surrounded by scandalized former friends who were inching away from her. He said that while Diane Caldwell wasn't currently facing criminal charges, the investigation was ongoing. Evidence suggested she'd been fully aware of her husband's plans, had actively participated in isolating me from support systems, and had used her social connections to spread damaging rumors about my character. She'd also been the one to convince Jessica's parents to take the mortgage payoff, leveraging their financial desperation to remove my closest friend. While not technically illegal, her actions showed a pattern of calculated cruelty that spoke to her character. The revelation about my mother's specific role in buying off Jessica hit particularly hard. The screens showed text messages between my mother and Jessica's mother, with Diane explicitly stating that the goal was to make me completely alone so I'd have no choice but to comply with the marriage. Shed written that desperate people make bad decisions, and if I had no friends and no support, I'd eventually break and come home. Seeing those words, that cold calculation, that complete lack of maternal love or concern for my well-being, hurt in a way even the disownment papers hadn't. At least with the disownment, my father had been angry and desperate. These texts from my mother were calm, methodical, planning my destruction like it was a business strategy. Jessica was crying harder now, her face buried in her hands, and I felt a strange mixture of vindication and pity. She'd been backed into a corner by her family's financial crisis and my mother's manipulation, but Shed still made the choice to betray 15 years of friendship. Some of our mutual friends from high school were in the audience, and I could see them looking at Jessica with expressions of disgust and disappointment. Her reputation was destroyed just as thoroughly as mine had been by Trevor's rumors, except her destruction was deserved. The scholarship I'd lost due to Trevor's false accusations was being fully restored, Wellington announced, and the committee was considering implementing new protocols to prevent similar abuse of their reporting system. Wellington then addressed something I hadn't even known was happening. During the investigation into my father's business, they'd discovered he'd been defrauding clients for years, inflating construction costs, using substandard materials while charging for premium ones, falsifying inspection reports. Multiple building projects had safety concerns that were being investigated by city officials. Some of the buildings he'd constructed over the past 5 years might need to be condemned or extensively renovated to meet actual safety codes. The scope of his fraud was enormous, affecting hundreds of people, and the legal consequences would extend far beyond his treatment of me. He was looking at potentially decades in prison if convicted on all charges. Trevor's future was equally destroyed, though not by criminal charges so much as by social consequences. Wellington mentioned that the university where Trevor had been attending, after seeing the evidence of his harassment campaign against me, had expelled him effective immediately. His scholarship, ironically funded by a foundation that Catherine Morrison had established, was revoked. Other universities in the area had been contacted and provided with the evidence of his behavior, and it was unlikely any reputable school would accept him now. His social media accounts, where he'd been so proud to film my humiliation, were flooded with comments condemning him. His friends had abandoned him publicly, posting their own statements about how disgusted they were by his actions. The consequences rippled outward to every corner of my family's life. Their social circle, the wealthy families who'd sat with them to watch my humiliation, were scrambling to distance themselves from the scandal. People who'd laughed along with my father's jokes about his difficult daughter were now claiming they'd always suspected something was wrong, that they'd never approved of his behavior. Fairweather friends disappeared overnight, calls went unreturned, invitations to social events were quietly withdrawn. The Caldwell name, which my father had been so proud of, which he'd claimed I'd disgraced by refusing the marriage, was now associated with fraud and abuse and criminal behavior. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Wellington announced that Morrison Industries was establishing a new foundation in my name, focused on helping young people escape abusive family situations. The foundation would provide financial support, legal assistance, and housing resources for college students who'd been cut off by controlling parents. It would offer scholarships specifically for students who'd maintained their grades despite facing family sabotage. It would create support networks so that people in my situation wouldn't have to face it alone the way I had. He said that Catherine Morrison had believed strongly in using wealth for social good, and this foundation would honor both her legacy and my experience by turning something painful into something that could help thousands of others. The standing ovation returned, even louder this time, as people processed the full scope of what had happened. Justice wasn't just being served, it was being delivered with precision and public accountability. My family's crimes weren't being swept under the rug or settled quietly. They were being exposed in full detail, and the consequences were matching the scope of their cruelty. As I stood there watching my father being led away, still in his designer suit but now in handcuffs, I felt something shift inside me. The fear I'd carried for months, the constant anxiety that they would find a way to destroy me, finally released its grip. They couldn't hurt me anymore. They had no power left. And more than that, their downfall was complete and public and permanent. There would be no coming back from this for any of them. 3 months later, I sat in my corner office on the 42nd floor of Morrison Industries headquarters, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city skyline. The office itself was elegant but not ostentatious, decorated with modern furniture and shelves filled with books about business strategy and leadership. On my desk, in a prominent position, sat a framed photograph of my grandmother Catherine, taken when she was about my age, her expression confident and determined. Next to it was the necklace Shed given me when I was 5, the one my father had taken. Wellington had it recovered from my father's safe deposit box and returned to me. I wore it every single day now, a reminder that I was loved, that I was protected, even by someone I barely remembered. My assistant, a competent woman named Patricia Hood, worked for Morrison Industries for 15 years, knocked and entered with a stack of documents. The trial date for my father had been set, she informed me. He was facing a staggering array of charges: fraud, embezzlement, attempted extortion, bribery, conspiracy. His lawyers were trying to negotiate a plea deal, but prosecutors weren't interested given the scope of his crimes and the number of victims. He was looking at a minimum of 15 years in federal prison, possibly as many as 30 if convicted on all counts. Patricia asked if I wanted to provide a victim impact statement at sentencing. I considered it and said yes. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted him to understand, truly understand, the damage Head caused not just to me, but to hundreds of others his fraud had affected. Trevor's situation was different but no less devastating to him. After being expelled, Head tried to enroll in several other schools, but none would accept him once they saw his record. Head dropped out of college entirely and was currently working at a car dealership, selling the same luxury vehicles he used to own, struggling to make commission. His social media presence, which Head valued so much, was destroyed. Most of his accounts were deleted after the harassment became unbearable. But screenshots of his cruel posts lived on, resurfacing whenever he tried to rebuild under a new name. Head tried to apologize to me through email, a rambling message full of excuses and self-pity, blaming our father for corrupting him, claiming he was just following orders. It deleted it without responding. Some betrayals don't deserve forgiveness. My mother had filed for divorce from my father within weeks of his arrest, hiring aggressive lawyers and trying to claim she'd been a victim of his schemes too, that she hadn't known the extent of his fraud. But the text messages Wellington had shown at graduation told a different story. She'd been a willing participant in everything, and while she might avoid criminal charges, her social standing was obliterated. She'd moved to her sister's house in another state, essentially in hiding from former friends and the media. The divorce was bitter, with my father's lawyers arguing she should get nothing since She'd helped destroy his life, and her lawyers arguing she was entitled to half of nothing, which was all that was left after the government seized most of his assets. I felt nothing when I heard about their legal battle. They'd made their choices, and now they were facing consequences. Gerald had been arrested trying to flee the country and was facing his own impressive list of charges. The loan sharks Head borrowed from were cooperating with federal prosecutors in exchange for reduced sentences on their own crimes, providing detailed testimony about Gerald's promises to repay them with my inheritance money after forcing me into marriage. Human trafficking charges were being considered, though those were harder to prove. At minimum, he was looking at fraud, conspiracy, and attempted extortion charges. His business empire, such as it was, collapsed immediately. Investors fled, partners cut ties, properties went into foreclosure. Last he'd heard, he was being held without bail, considered a flight risk after his airport incident. Jessica's story was perhaps the most quietly tragic. She hadn't broken any laws by accepting my mother's bribe and abandoning our friendship, but the social consequences were severe. Our mutual friends had cut her off completely once the truth came out. She'd lost her campus housing at her university after other students protested having her as a resident. She'd transferred to a different school in another state, trying to escape the scandal. But the story had spread too far. Job applications were rejected after background checks revealed her role in the case, even though Shed committed no crime. Shed sent me dozens of letters, each one more desperate than the last, begging for forgiveness, explaining that her parents had been about to lose their house. I understood her situation intellectually, but I couldn't forgive her. Shed had options. She could have warned me, could have refused despite the pressure. She chose money over me, and that choice had consequences. My own life had transformed beyond recognition. The luxury penthouse I now lived in was a far cry from that basement apartment with cockroaches and leaking ceilings. I had security, comfort, stability for the first time in months. But more than the physical luxury, I had freedom. I could make my own choices without fear of punishment, could pursue my own goals without anyone trying to sabotage me, could simply exist without constantly looking over my shoulder. The therapy Eid started helped me process the trauma of everything Eid endured. My therapist specialized in family estrangement and abuse, and she helped me understand that grieving for the family Id wanted was normal and necessary, even as I accepted that the family Id actually had was toxic and dangerous. Professor Martinez remained a constant presence in my life, transitioning from emergency shelter provider to mentor to friend. She sat on the board of the foundation Wellington and I had established, using her academic expertise to help design programs that actually addressed the needs of students in abusive situations. We had lunch at least once a week, and Shed taken on a role similar to what I imagined a grandmother might, offering advice without judgment, support without conditions. She told me once that Catherine would have loved seeing me thrive, that the determination in my eyes reminded her of Catherine in her prime. That meant more to me than any amount of money ever could. The foundation itself had become my passion project. In just 3 months, WED already helped 40 students escape controlling family situations, providing emergency housing, legal support, and financial assistance. WED partnered with universities to create safe reporting systems for family-induced sabotage. WED established a network of lawyers who specialized in emancipation and restraining orders. Every person we helped felt like a small victory, like turning my pain into something meaningful. Id received hundreds of letters from people around the country, sharing their own stories of family abuse and thanking me for speaking out. Many said that watching the graduation ceremony video, which had indeed gone viral with millions of views, had given them courage to leave their own toxic families. My position at Morrison Industries was challenging but rewarding. I was learning the business from the ground up, working under Wellington's mentorship, attending board meetings, and asking questions and slowly understanding the empire my grandmother had built. The other executives had been skeptical at first, seeing me as a nepotism hire, the granddaughter riding her legacy, but I'd proven myself by working harder than anyone, staying late, studying financial reports until I understood every detail, bringing fresh perspectives informed by my business degree and my generation's values. Within a month, they were seeking my input on marketing strategies and corporate culture initiatives. Within 2 months, Id proposed a restructuring of our internship program that was being implemented company-wide. I was earning my place. The trial date approached, and I prepared my victim impact statement. I wrote about the girl I'd been, desperate for my father's approval, working herself to exhaustion for a scrap of pride from parents who saw her as a commodity. I wrote about the systematic destruction of my support systems, the calculated cruelty of each attack, the months of homelessness and hunger and fear. But I also wrote about survival, about discovering strength I didn't know I had, about the grandmother who loved me enough to protect me from beyond the grave. I wrote about choosing freedom over family, and how that choice, though painful, had saved my life. I wanted the judge to understand what my father had done, but I also wanted my father to understand that Head failed. Head tried to break me, and instead, Head forged me into someone stronger. On the day I delivered that statement in court, facing my father across a courtroom for the first time since graduation, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't expected. He looked smaller somehow, diminished in his prison jumpsuit, his usual arrogance replaced with bitterness and defeat. When I read my statement aloud, detailing every moment of suffering Head caused, I watched his face and saw no remorse, no regret, just anger that had been caught. And in that moment, I understood with perfect clarity that nothing I'd ever done could have made him love me the way I deserved. The problem was never me. It was always him, his greed, his need for control, his inability to see his own daughter as a human being rather than an asset to be exploited. The judge sentenced him to 22 years in federal prison. 22 years, the same as my age, the age at which I'd finally escaped his control. The symmetry felt fitting. He would likely die in prison, an old man with no legacy except destruction and fraud. His construction company had been dissolved, his reputation destroyed, his family scattered. Everything Head valued, money and status and power, was gone. And me, the daughter Head tried so hard to control and diminish, I was thriving in ways Head never imagined possible. I walked out of that courtroom with my head high, knowing I would never see him again, and feeling nothing but relief. Now, sitting in my office overlooking the city, I thought about the journey that had led here. From that graduation ceremony where I'd sat alone clutching disownment papers, to this moment of peace and success and genuine happiness, I'd lost a family, yes, but I'd gained something more valuable, myself. My identity wasn't tied to their approval anymore. My worth wasn't determined by their love. I was Rebecca Morrison, Catherine Morrison's granddaughter, inheritor of her legacy not just financially but spiritually. I was a survivor, a fighter, someone who refused to be controlled or diminished. The foundation was hosting its first major fundraising gala next month, and I was giving the keynote speech. I'd been working on it for weeks, trying to capture everything I'd learned and wanted to share. The core message was simple but powerful. Blood doesn't make family. Love and respect do. My grandmother had left me more than money. She'd left me freedom, the freedom to choose my own path and the security to walk it without fear. I wanted everyone trapped in controlling families to know that escape was possible, that life beyond abuse existed, that they were worth more than their families said they were. It ended my speech with a reflection I'd written late one night, looking at my grandmother's photograph. To anyone trapped by controlling family members, remember that your worth isn't defined by their approval. There's a life waiting for you beyond their manipulation, a life where you can breathe freely and make choices without fear. It won't be easy to leave, and some days the grief of losing family will feel unbearable even when you know leaving was right. But you're stronger than you think, and you deserve love that doesn't come with conditions or controls. You deserve to be free. Standing there in my office, I called up Professor Martinez to confirm our lunch plans. We were meeting at a new restaurant downtown, and afterward, we were visiting the scholarship recipients to check on their progress. These small moments of connection, of building a chosen family based on mutual respect and genuine care, these were what made life meaningful. I thought about the girl I'd been 6 months ago, sleeping in library study rooms, working 3 jobs, believing she was worthless, because her family said so. If I could go back and tell her anything, I'd tell her to hold on just a little longer, that everything was about to change, that she was going to be okay. Better than okay. She was going to be free. My name is Rebecca Morrison. I'm 22 years old, and I'm finally free. Free from abuse, free from control, free from the desperate need for approval from people incapable of giving it. The disownment papers my father forced me to sign that graduation morning had felt like death, but they'd actually been liberation. Being legally cut off from people who only wanted to use me was a gift, even if it hadn't felt like one at the time. My grandmother knew that freedom sometimes comes with a cost, and she'd made sure I had the resources to pay it. She'd given me the greatest gift possible, the ability to choose my own life and the strength to build it on my own terms. So let me ask you something. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and your own freedom? Have you ever felt controlled or manipulated by the people who were supposed to love you most? Drop a comment below and tell me your story, because you're not alone. If this story resonated with you, if it gave you hope or courage or just let you know that survival is possible, hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel because there are more stories of resilience and survival coming your way. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, someone who feels trapped, someone who needs to know that escape is possible and life beyond abuse is real and beautiful. Your support through likes, comments, and shares helps these stories reach more people who desperately need to hear them. Thank you for listening to my story, for bearing witness to what I survived and how I fought back. Thank you for being part of this community that believes in speaking truth about family abuse, that understands choosing yourself isn't selfish, that knows sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from people who hurt you. I hope you find your own freedom, whatever that looks like for you. I hope you discover your worth and refuse to let anyone diminish it. And I hope you remember that you deserve love that lifts you up, not tears you down. Stay strong, stay brave, and never let anyone make you feel small. Until next time, this is Rebecca Morrison reminding you that you are worthy, you are valuable, and you are free to choose your own path.